Thank you everybody for joining our Orange County Coastkeeper streams. My name is Katie Nichols. I'm the Marine Restoration Director with Coastkeeper. So welcome you all. Today we want to talk a little bit about sustainable seafood. So this is something that I'm really passionate about. I used to work before Coastkeeper for NOAA Fisheries Service. And so just gathered some tips about how you can choose sustainable seafood if you eat seafood. And it's a really important time since we're all kind of home and quarantined. You might be cooking more, and it's a good time to support local businesses because the seafood industry has taken a bit of a hit in this time. So feel free to type in questions to the chat box as we go or towards the end. I'm happy to answer any questions. So my first tip is one you might make sense. It's to buy local. So here in the United States, we consume about 5 billion pounds of seafood every year, and about 90% of that comes from other countries. So a lot of those other countries like China and Vietnam don't have the strict environmental regulations and fisheries management laws that we do here in the US. So most of our US fisheries are managed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and then specifically within that, the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA Fisheries. And so we have a pretty specific and intense management process to manage our catch and environmental processes here in the US. So buying things that are caught in the US is a good idea. Drawing down from that, if you're on the Pacific, you should eat things coming from the Pacific. The more you can get things that are coming closer and supporting local economies, the better. And then further down from that, if you've heard of, farm to table, farm to fork, there's a thing called boat to fork. So there are what's known as community supported fisheries, or CSFs, kind of like a CSA for agriculture or something like a farmer's market for your produce. There are those for fisheries as well. An example in Orange County is called Seaforth Fisheries. Today I'm going to share a link on our social media on kind of a mapping tool to figure out where you can get local seafood if you want to support businesses in that way. A lot of our seafood, though, about half of it comes from farms as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that towards the end about aquaculture. So first tip is buy local. The next tip is think small. So by that, I mean that eating lower down on the food chain is a really good idea when it comes to seafood usually. Species that are smaller, such as mackerel, sardines, anchovies, they're usually fast-growing species, and they have a life history that supports being harvested. And what I mean by that is they tend to be fast-growing, and they're early to sexually mature. So they can withstand some fishing pressure versus something that has a really slower life history, let's say, where they take a long time to reach sexual maturity. If we fish those species heavily, they don't recover as quickly. Thinking small also helps in terms of concerns with mercury. So larger species have what's known as biomagnification. So as you go up the food chain, species like a tuna or a skipjack, something really large, is going to tend to have accumulated more toxins over its lifespan than something smaller. The last tip with thinking small is thinking smaller portions. So if you're able to economically buy a higher quality seafood, you might be able to get it, keep your costs down if you think of it as a smaller portion and supplement it with some other veggies and things in your recipe. The next tip is to diversify. So year after year, Americans predominantly eat the same 5 species of seafood. And I'll give you a minute to kind of think about what you think those are before I tell you. You might be able to come up with the top 3. So the top ones are shrimp, salmon, tuna, primarily canned tuna, tilapia, and pollock. And those last 2 were a little bit surprising to me. I was thinking maybe it would be halibut or cod, but those are the kind of top ones. And really we don't eat a lot of diversity here in the US and really globally. We really heavily rely on the same types of fish, and that creates a lot of problems with overfishing and habitat modification. And whereas if we could kind of diversify and eat kind of less common or sometimes unappreciated species, something like a mullet or a scup that are sometimes thought of like trash fish or not as desirable, they can be really good and they can spread out sort of the impact. So that's the tip with diversify. The next tip is to ask questions. And so this is kind of a catch-all for a lot of different tips. So when we ask questions, we help to shape the demand. And consumer demand is something that's really important when you're talking about seafood sustainability. So asking questions if you're at a restaurant or if you're at the grocery store is something really important. So if you're at the grocery store, you can ask what's fresh, what's in season, and stick to something local if you can. But sometimes, you know, seafood does have seasonality to it. So something frozen, if you're not, you know, you're not looking to get the same thing year to year, season to season, frozen options can still be really good. If you're at a restaurant, you could ask, is this fish sustainable? I haven't really asked that as much back when I was working at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, when some of these seafood considerations still came out, you get some weird looks if you ask that. But asking each time is kind of helping to shape the demand. So if your server or fish retailer has no idea, that might be one clue about the business and whether you want to continue going there. But if they don't know anything about the sustainability, you might be able to ask where it's from, how it's harvested, and if it's certified. So I want to talk a little bit about tools when you're shopping and looking for seafood. So I'm going to share my screen. See that? So there are a couple different tools if you're looking to kind of research whether or not seafood is sustainable. One that I mentioned is NOAA Fisheries. So they have a pretty extensive website that looks at different characteristics of seafood, as well as Monterey Bay Aquarium puts out a seafood watch. So back when I was in college was when this kind of was first starting, and I was in charge of handing out these cards when the program kind of first got going. And there's other ones out there, but I wanted to highlight the Aquarium Seafood Watch card because I think it's a pretty cool program and pretty intuitive. So what it is, it's basically a rating system, and they have what's known as these cards, and you can download these specific to your region, and it will tell you what type of seafood you're looking at based on where it's from. If it's a good choice, if it's kind of in the yellow category, maybe proceed with caution, or if it's something you want to avoid. So how do they come up with that sustainability, and what does that really mean? You can also go on their website, and I wanted to show you that really quick. So I've gone in here and I've typed in oysters, and here you can get even a ton more information than what's on the card. So you can put in the type of seafood, where it's coming from, did it have any certification, and then you can pull up all of this information, which is awesome. And so here it says Pacific oysters farmed are a good choice because shellfish environmental impacts typically are low, feeds and fertilizers not used as much, and the habitat impacts are pretty low. So shellfish farmed sustainably with the good environmental processes, like in the US, is a pretty good choice. Now, if you're talking about wild-caught seafood, there's a label that you can look for, and it's called the Marine Stewardship Council. So this is a label you might see on packaged seafood if you're looking at the grocery store. Now, how do they come up with these types of certifications and these programs? What do they look at? So I just presented this graphic. I'm not going to go too in depth, but I wanted to cover some of the overview of information that goes into these certifications and seafood sustainability programs. So things that they're looking at is the species vulnerable to overfishing? That might have to do with that kind of life history characteristics I was mentioning. The health and status of the overall population. Has it been heavily fished over long periods of time? Is it slow growing? And then bycatch is a big issue. So if you're thinking of something like a shrimp, depending on how it's caught, if it's farmed or wild caught, you may get a lot of unwanted species within that catch for shrimp, things like turtles, other bottom fish, and get a lot of unnecessary catch or unwanted fish. For each pound of shrimp, you get something like 10 pounds of bycatch. So it tends to be a pretty destructive type of fishing for shrimp, generally speaking. And then the impact of the fishing method on the habitat is something really important to consider. So is it something like a bottom trawl? Is it hook and line? That's something that you would take into account when thinking about how you choose seafood. And then where it's coming from and the management and all that kind of stuff is things that go into choosing sustainability. So what I did was I looked around for different types of these certifications because, as I mentioned, over half of our seafood comes from aquaculture. And there's two main aquaculture certifications that are common. There's BAP and ASC. So I did a little bit of research to think about, what do these certifications really mean and how do you notice them? How do you know if it is good, if this means it's a good choice? So I did a little poll of family and friends to look at what they had in their fridge, in their freezer. And I got back a lot of those common species, the shrimp, the tilapia, the salmon, and then halibut and cod. So this is tilapia from my sister's freezer, and it had this BAP certification. So this is what it would look like in the packaging. And you can actually see here on the left, there's a certification number. And so I doubt many people would go this in depth, but for the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to show you what this kind of actually means. Hopefully you can see this website. You can actually look up that certification number and see where it's from. And then this particular one is certified at different phases of the process. So the processor, the farm, all of these different sources could have this label on it, but what does that really mean? And does that mean it's sustainable? You have to get kind of really in depth with that, because this one has a 4-star rating, but it doesn't imply that all 100% of each of those steps is 100% environmentally sustainable at all steps. But it is good that it does have a certification on it. So that's an example. Here's an example with shrimp here on the right. So this is jumbo shrimp, but caught in India and farm raised. So it does have that certification, but again, not from the US, probably some different environmental regulations there. So even though there might be a certification, it doesn't mean it's the best choice possible. Next, we have some halibut. So this is wild caught in product of the USA. No certifications on it, but product of the US, wild caught, that's pretty good, probably. The next one is cod, and this was interesting because here on the left it says it's sustainably caught, but what does that mean? That's not any kind of rigorous certification program or stamp versus this one on the right that has that Marine Stewardship Council certification here. So it's wild caught, it tells you where it's from, and it also has a certification. So that's, at least you're getting some informative packaging there. This is another interesting one. So it was from Alaska, and we know that in the US, we usually have some pretty good fishery management laws, but it says wild, natural, sustainable. So that's not any type of certification program. That's basically just kind of an eco label that's not really telling you that much. So it does take some homework. Hopefully that's a kind of a good overview. There are a lot of resources out there, websites like NOAA Fisheries, Seafood Watch. There are also some really cool books out there. Paul Greenberg has a book called For Fish that kind of talks about seafood history and our relationship with kind of 4 fish species that we've historically harvested over time. Another good author for if you're interested in fishery and history is Mark Kurlansky. There's also a couple of good movies out if you have some time and want to kind of dig into the topic. Patagonia just released one that's, I believe, on YouTube called Artificial. It talks about salmon fishing specifically. It's a pretty cool, well done film, I think. If you're looking for something a little bit lighter, there's also salmon fishing in the Yemen. Has a little bit of romance in it as well, a little bit lighter, but that's another kind of fun one. But I highly encourage people to ask questions, seek out your local fisheries and restaurants that you can support, which is particularly important right now, and get informed about the choices that you're making for your seafood. My email address is on our website, which is coastkeeper.org. If you want to check us out and donate, you can also find my email address there. It's katie@coastkeeper.org. And thank you guys so much.